fire. The purpose of today is to answer questions for our citizens regarding how could such an event have happened with little or no notice on a calm Sunday night in Mendocino County. And what we're going to do is to give you a general view of the situation at the beginning, and then get a little bit specific of to times and circumstances that occurred. We have, because there's attorneys involved, let me start with this. I won't miss a word. This information presented is based on the records available to the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office as of today, November 9th, 2017. Data continues to be collected and analyzed, and the information presented today could change based on new facts once they're discovered. These times are estimates based on the best information and knowledge currently available to the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office, and I certainly would like to thank Jared for putting this together. You've been on this for several days, a couple weeks actually, and we think what we have is a very good overview of the first 12 hours of the fire. And it's important you understand the first 12 hours of the fire is when the lives were lost and the vast majority of structures were lost. Actually, within the first 4 hours of the fire is when the real tragic events occurred. So with us today, I have two CAL FIRE deputy chiefs. I have Scott McLean from Sacramento, and you are the state PIO for CAL FIRE. Yes, sir. And I have Brett Pinson, deputy chief here in Mendocino County. That they will be allowed to, or they will be available to answer some questions. Let me say this press conference will not go past 11:15 because today is an incredibly busy day. So we are going to try to get everything taken care of. We also have the two main fire chiefs from this area here with us today. I'd like to thank Chief Bill Pauley from Powder Valley Fire Department being here today. You just learned of this yesterday, and I appreciate you being here. And interim chief, acting chief, Brendan Turner, who was filling in as chief as this occurred and did nothing short of heroic, magnificent job during this. Brent, I hope you understand. We watched you and we saw what a great job you did. So let's get started. If you can see the red outline on this outline was prepared by county, the informational services folks for me just yesterday. And this was not from CAL FIRE, this is what we believe is an approximate map of the fire. And when I say approximate, the yellow dot that you see on the far right, which is outside the fire perimeter, is actually, according to Chief Pauley, a very good location of the first place that he saw fire. And let me tell you that there are no roads, there's no public roads or state highways going anywhere close there. This was near a vineyard. Actually, Chief Pauley owns a vineyard, and to get access to where the fire was started, the fire engines could not access what we know as Powerhouse Road because of the lines down and trees were down because of the significant windstorm. And so the very first time that, as we know, that a firefighter, a first responder, put eyes on a fire was on the far right side of the fire perimeter that you see there, where I have the yellow dot. And the reason I'm being very general on this, and not being so specific, and CAL FIRE will talk about it. CAL FIRE's investigation is not ready to be released. CAL FIRE's investigation is going to be accurate when they release it, and it's going to give more specificity than what I have today. Today's meeting was discussed at the public meeting we had in Redwood Valley last week, when so many citizens had questions of how this could have happened. And so we have been working on it, and so that's what you're gonna get today. And so with Chief Pauley telling me, he had me move the yellow dot here 20 minutes ago to make sure that we got exactly where we thought the fire was. So as we get started, let's talk about the first 12 hours. And I do wanna say, the patch that you see on the front there of the first slide and the picture, these are in the first 12 hours. These were the initial responding government entities that responded, and that fire that you see there is 4.5 hours after this dot. So 4.5 hours after this fire was seen. The fire you're looking at was here, and that's one of our main communication towers. As a crow flies, it's approximately 9 miles from where the fire started to where it took out one of the main critical infrastructure devices that our county has, and not just a county, but CAL FIRE also. The next is just a quick overview of all of the government agencies in the first 12 hours that responded based on a critical incident, and every one of those players up there played a very important part of the first 12 hours of either providing assistance to citizens or helping law enforcement and fire do the evacuation. So now the next slide is probably one of the most important, and as some people may find weather boring, but I'm going to tell you, and I've read that, the weather conditions were something that we absolutely have to look into as why this happened the way it happened. The fact that the relative humidity in Mendocino County in this area, not the coast, but in this area, had not gone less than 45% in the 16 days prior to this is very important. And when I say that, when relative humidity, what we're talking about is the moisture that we usually get at night, which is on our windshield maybe in the morning, or the dew on the grass. For 45 days, or for 16 days, we did not see that kind of relative humidity coming into Mendocino County. Was it noticed? Maybe by some. I was not made aware of it. This is basically, it's getting close to what the Weather Service and CAL FIRE would call a red flag fire conditions, and there were red flag fire conditions. So at 2 p.m. on Sunday, when the winds were being witnessed, this wasn't an estimate, winds were coming in at 35 miles an hour. So we put that in conjunction, in addition to the relative humidity, and then they were upgraded to 50 miles an hour, not just predicted, but it was witnessed. And then in the evening came the gusts of wind, and the gusts of wind up to 75 miles an hour, very specifically near the fire's place where it was first seen. I heard that it was absolutely witnessed at 68 miles an hour. And then one of the things that we're going to show you is, as the wind was coming in, which direction the fire went, and basically the fires went up the draws. I am not a fire expert, but I think we're talking some basic fire principles here that we can all understand. When we have just come out of a multi-year drought and the fuel conditions, we've gone basically 6 months without any rain, and the fuel conditions, while we did have a heavy rain this last winter, the dead trees from the drought were there. And the brush, the manzanita, and if you know our local topography, the manzanita brush has oil in it, and these bits of vegetation were absolutely at a flammable level. And as CAL FIRE said, some of this area has not burnt in 60 years. So I heard it hasn't burnt since 64, which is since I was born, but 60 years makes it before I was born, so it hasn't burned in 60 years. And then, as I said, the dead and standing material were there. So what we're telling you is that all of these conditions were happening at the time that we had a very significant windstorm. Go ahead. So at midnight, at 11:30 at night, a Sunday night in Mendocino County, this is the staffing before the fires that happened. So when we had 2 dispatchers at most first responding locations, and that's the staffing we had county-wide, and there were no significant events happening at 11:30 on Sunday night. Law enforcement was doing basic traffic stops. There were, I think there was 1 domestic violence that our deputies were handling. So that is when the first fire report came in at 11:34. So this is 4 minutes before the first fire report of what government had on duty for first responding. And when I say CAL FIRE had those on duty, obviously at nighttime, CAL FIRE firefighters sleep like the rest of us, and so their dozers and their helitack crews were all getting rest from Sunday night, ready to work on Monday morning. Okay, go ahead. So this is a slide that I am going to refer back to many times because of what happened during the fire. There's a lot of questions of why didn't maybe reverse 911 happen immediately? Why didn't some things happen? And what this slide is telling you is once the fire started, these were the calls that came into our 911 centers. And so we have three 911 centers up there, and then we'll get an EOC. But so the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office, CAL FIRE, and Ukiah Police Department all were taking 911 calls. And you can see exactly what happened between the hours of 11 o'clock at midnight, and we went to 94. This is just with the Sheriff's Office, and 121. Now, some of these numbers are duplicated because a 911 often, if it's on a hard line, will come to the Sheriff's Office first. We're the hub of 911. And then when somebody says the word fire or medical, then our dispatchers will immediately transfer it to the appropriate agency, and this would be transferring it to Howard Forest CAL FIRE station, because Howard Forest is going to be dispatching for the local fire departments in that area. So some of those numbers may be duplicated, but still those dispatchers had to take those amount of calls. And you can see a couple things here. And as we get going down here, something really interesting happens. If you see CAL FIRE's calls here and start getting down, and at 11 o'clock they get to 0. You see the Sheriff's Office calls the first part of the fire, and then they also almost get cut in half, and they maintain at this location. In Ukiah Police Department, they basically are maintaining what they would get as some cell phone calls from out of the area, from out of the city of Ukiah area. And then they would be taking regular hardline phones of people calling in regarding why is there so much smoke in the area and so forth. And then the Emergency Operations Center, you can see what time it was opened at 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, so 4.5 hours into this unprecedented fire, the county's EOC was opened, and the emergency numbers, the 467-6824 number that we talked about over and over, that was being given out to the public through social media and through our dispatchers. So you can see that the EOC started taking over the burden of the emergency calls, and this is exactly what the EOC is for, to relieve the burden from the 911 dispatchers and allow 911 dispatchers to communicate to citizens having emergencies and the radio units, fire and police and sheriff, that are out there in the field. So you can see the numbers go. While the unanswered calls are there, I'm going to say that when you're inundated with so many 911 calls, sometimes people will let it ring 4 times and they'll just hang up, and that counts as an unanswered call because we didn't get it within the 4 rings. So these are all computerized. This is not, we weren't making slashes and so forth on pieces of paper. We requested from the computer these stats, and this is exactly what we got. So this is, as you see, from Sunday at 11 o'clock at night to noon on Monday. And the reason that we're going to be going back to this is because, as I said, we're going to get to the reverse 911 calls in a minute. What time they went out, at what time they were requested, what time they went out. And I certainly want to give a shout out to all 911 dispatchers during this. They were doing something that they have never done before. They've never taken this many calls before. And certainly, if you look at the 4-county area, the Sonoma, Lake, Mendocino, and Napa County Fire, it is the largest fire situation in a state of California history. Correct, CAL FIRE? So what we're saying here is we had dispatchers doing, for the most part, superhuman things of answering the phones, as well as these are the same 2 dispatchers that were talking to the deputy sheriffs on the road, or the same CAL FIRE dispatchers that were talking to the fire engines that were responding to the scene. So they were beyond multitasking. Okay, so as we go to the first scene, the first slide of the activity, this is how I want you to please understand. We've set it up. We've certainly talked about how we can put this in a way that is understandable, and it's tough because so many things are happening at one time. So I want to talk about the red arrow here in the middle. The red arrow is soon, in a couple slides, is going to turn into 2 arrows, because we have a red arrow that's going to represent Potter Valley Fire, and we have a blue arrow that's going to represent Redwood Valley Fire, not fire departments, but the Potter Valley Fire and the Redwood Valley Fire. Now, let me tell you a huge bit of confusion. Potter Valley, by locals, is often referred to as the valley. Redwood Valley is often referred to as by locals as the valley. Potter Valley's two main roads are East Road and West Road. Redwood Valley's two main roads are East Road and West Road. So you have this incredible predicament here where the word valley, East Road, and West Road can be used for both valleys, both Potter Valley and Redwood Valley. So as we go along here, what we've tried to do is we've tried to color coordinate the calls that are happening as we go along here. And please understand, not everything that happened is on the radio, because as Chief Pauly stated, when he was talking to his firefighters on either non-repeater channel or on the phone or in person, we don't have any documentation of that, because that happened because he was doing what chiefs do best. He was directing, he was leading from the front. He was the first one on the scene. So as we start, the very first call comes in from a Potter Valley resident around, as Jared said, 11:34 p.m. So 11:34 is when the first bell is rung. And we transfer the call to CAL FIRE because that's what the standard operating procedure is. And CAL FIRE starts doing their dispatching. And I want you to know, as CAL FIRE, within 30 minutes, this is very significant. And I've been in this county for 35 years. I've never known of this to happen. Within 30 minutes of this fire dispatch coming in, CAL FIRE dispatched every available CAL FIRE fire engine with the exception of Covelo. Is that correct, Brett?
Yeah, the CAL FIRE units.
CAL FIRE units, with the exception of the Covelo CAL FIRE unit, was dispatched. So Point Arena, 2.5 hours away if you're in a fire engine. Fort Bragg, Leggett, they were all dispatched to this because CAL FIRE was aware of the red flag conditions and the initial reports that Chief Pauly had given. So, I'm not making excuses. I want to say, as we go along here, this is where some of the confusion is starting right now, because Chief Pauly has seen the fire, as I said, where the yellow dot is, and his analogy is, if you take a rock and skip it across a still lake, wherever the rock skips, you're going to see, obviously, ripples. As Chief Pauly was standing here, he saw the fire in a skipping fashion going to the southwest. It was going up a draw to the southwest. And this is, as I said, area which was heavy brush, heavy timber, and very, very dry grass. So within the first within the first hour of this fire, Chief Pauly on the air told CAL FIRE that he was estimating this fire to be 5,000 acres. Is that correct, Chief? Up to 5,000 acres. So within the first hour, this area of west of Potter Valley, and when I say Potter Valley, Redwood Valley, please don't split them down the middle here. For the most part, right along where my hand is, separates the area known as Potter Valley and Redwood Valley. So from Chief Pauly, who's been in Potter Valley for the most part his whole life, who knows the area very well, within the hour he said, this is up to 5,000 acres. Potential, okay. So, now this is very, very important. That happened at 11:41. The power for all of Potter Valley north of Main Street was out. And why is that so significant? Because there's a cell tower in Potter Valley that operates using electricity. And the power was out, and that initial outage caused many, many cell phones in Potter Valley, not all, but many, many cell phones in Potter Valley to go out. So the power outage was very important to understand. And then at 11:43 is when Chief Pauly says he needs mutual aid from CAL FIRE, and that's when CAL FIRE was sending every available fire engine. So you'll notice that right now, everything is Potter Valley. There's nothing Redwood Valley here. Everything is on the Potter Valley side. And at one time, Chief Pauly saw fire in at least 4 locations. I'm not saying that Chief Pauly saw 4 fires. I'm saying that Chief Pauly saw fire in at least 4 locations. Because neither I nor the CAL FIRE are going to say how many fires there were, because I don't know if that will ever absolutely, with determination, be told or be learned how many fires there were because of the windstorm that was happening and the arcing. So at 11:50 approximately, we have a deputy that calls dispatch. It says he hears there's a fire in Potter Valley. And so one of the unfortunate situations in our county is we have 5 911 centers. We have CAL FIRE, we have CHP, we have Ukiah Police Department, Willis Police Department, and the Sheriff's Office. And there's not always, all the information is not shared with all 911 centers of what's happening. So the deputy hears of a fire and lets dispatch know. Here's reports from CHP that there's a fire in Potter Valley. And so our deputies are now aware of it. Remember, we have 2 deputies and a sergeant on. So let's see, anything other significance there? Okay, everything speaks for itself. When Chief Pauly speaks power lines are down and trees down, let me tell you what that meant. As I said earlier, the Powerhouse Road access is to the east of where the fire was. And Chief Pauly's first responding unit stated he could not get to the fire because of down trees and down power lines. And so that's when Chief Pauly had access going through his vineyard at that point, correct? All right, next slide. So we're still remember the red arrow is Potter Valley and the blue arrow is going to be Redwood Valley Fire. So one of the things that fire chiefs have the power of is contacting PG&E and saying, will you turn the power off to this community? And Chief Pauly made an incredibly great decision to contact PG&E and request the PG&E be turned off for Potter Valley area, and that also contributed to the cell phone outage. We had a deputy sheriff responding to a burglar call. It wasn't a burglar call, but whenever there's electricity going on and off, it certainly activates burglar calls or whatever alarm calls. And so we had Sergeant Whitaker in the area who saw the fire and was in touch with his boss to say, we have a fire out here. So Redwood Valley Fire at 12:30. So at 12:30, Sheriff's Office gets the first 911 call that there's a fire in Redwood Valley. So this is 1 hour, and I want to show you that what we're talking about here. From the first area that we believe it started, the first fire was located in this general area where my finger is to the, I think it's to the right, Brendan, to the east of a Fisher Lake area. So while it was an independent fire, it's fair to say that it was in the same direction as the wind was blowing from the original fire. I'm not a fire expert. If this was a spot fire, it was a spot fire. If it wasn't, it wasn't. I'm saying that the direction that the wind was going and then the fire that was in Redwood Valley would be consistent with an ember going in the same direction as the wind. And it's interesting, the first call, if I can go back actually, the first call from Potter Valley that we got from citizen, the very first call, a citizen reported lightning. Lightning and a fire. So that was our first bit of information. We can always conclude that maybe lightning was a transformer or maybe lightning was lightning, I don't know. But that was the first call that government was given. So as we continue down here, and now we're going to get into a lot of the, where the blocks are going to change colors to green and going to with the Sheriff's Office, because a lot of the information here was obtained from Sheriff's Office because fire units were so busy doing exactly what they're doing, what they're supposed to do. They weren't letting their dispatcher know what those duties were, what their jobs were. So as we go along here, you're going to see that what Jared has been able to piece together here is based on information. We got some information from CAL FIRE, some information from Redwood Valley, Potter Valley Fire, some from citizens, certainly deputy sheriffs. That's how we obtained it. And as we go down this road, you'll understand what we're talking about. So next slide, please. All right. So one of the units with CAL FIRE, a dozer unit, was responding. He saw the fire, and he saw lots of fires, and he unloaded his dozer, and he started attacking a fire there in Potter Valley on Main Street. And there were the fire departments at this point, and I'll let the fire department speak to this. I'm not the expert, but they were staging to protect houses. And that's very important, because we think of fire departments of fighting fire, but there will be a time in just a little bit where a very critical decision was made of no longer fighting fire, but going strictly to saving lives, of pounding on doors and getting people out. So right there, we see CAL FIRE doing what is absolutely expected of CAL FIRE and I'm sorry, Potter Valley, of protecting houses, and the units are starting to arrive in the area. Now, at this point, when Redwood Valley Fire had been requested mutual aid to Potter Valley, Chief Turner made a very good decision. As his volunteers were arriving at the fire station, they could see fire to the northeast of their fire station, up in the mountains. And Chief Turner said, well, we're going to have a fire too. And so Redwood Valley fire engines made a decision to stay in Redwood Valley to fight the fire that was heading towards Redwood Valley. And that was at 12:50 is when the fire was seen coming over the ridge in this general area. So I'm pointing to west of Potter Valley by about 4.5 miles. Now, Chief Pauly, during the initial part of the fire, and I want you to think of how fast a fire would travel. If you've ever been around a grass fire, 2 to 3 miles an hour might be a normal rate of spread for a grass fire. Chief Pauly was in his truck, and he paced the fire on a road as he's driving next to the fire, and he was pacing the fire at 15 miles an hour. Now, that doesn't sound really fast when you're driving 15 miles an hour, but when you consider a fire that in 1 hour can go 15 miles, that's certainly very, very significant. And that was where decisions were being made of, are we going to put firefighters in front of this fire, where how can you stage 15 when a fire is heading to 15 miles an hour? It's very tough to do. So there were, Chief, and Paulie, I'm looking at you. I think there were a couple fires that had been seen in Potter Valley that your firefighters had put out that physically were not connected to the big fire. Correct. Good. So possible spotting fires in that area. Okay. All right. Next. All right. So at midnight 1:15 is when Sergeant Whitaker, who's in Potter Valley, is saying a reverse 911 evacuation should be in Potter Valley. Sergeant Whitaker certainly was not aware of what anybody else was aware of, other than some firefighters, that the fire had now crossed into what we would know as the Redwood Valley area. So Sergeant Whitaker's reverse 911 request was for the general area on the west side of Potter Valley, the northwest part of Potter Valley. And you can see that at midnight, or at 1:15, Lieutenant Cadillo wanted to do a reverse 911 with dispatch to get a better idea. And Sergeant Cadillo, or Lieutenant Cadillo, was at first was going to Potter Valley, but then went to Redwood Valley. So at this point, CHP is setting up roadblocks because of literally the fire is crossing roads, and CAL FIRE is is working with the local agencies on the firefighting techniques. And then the evacuations on the East Road, West Road, Tomkai Road area began. I have a red dot here that is where Fisher Lake is. Fisher Lake is where there were 40-some houses that not a single house survived, and also where there were elderly victims of the fire that were fatalities. I have a red dot here which signifies other fatalities, and then we have a yellow dot here. And what the yellow dot here is right around 1:30, and I'm going to ask you to start it. This is a deputy sheriff, and what I'd like for you to watch for with this video, it's a short video, is the wind that's happening and the glow in the distance. And this video is taken as a deputy is driving south. All right.
This is the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office. Anyone that hears this notice, be advised we are ordering evacuations for the Redwood Valley area. Please move south out of the Redwood Valley area. This is the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office. Anyone that can hear this notice, we are ordering evacuations, mandatory evacuations, for all people to move out of the Redwood Valley area towards 101. This is the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office. Anyone that can hear this notice, we are ordering mandatory evacuations. Please leave your home at once and move towards US 101. This is the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office. If you can hear this notice, we are ordering evacuations out of Redwood Valley. Move towards 101. Vehicles here, if you do not live here, turn around at once and drive towards 101. Yes.
We have an older person right here we're trying to get out.
Okay. Okay, watch yourself.
Thank you.
This is the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office. Anyone that can hear this notice, we are ordering mandatory evacuations out of the Redwood Valley area. Please.
So that's what was happening with law enforcement and CAL FIRE actually on the north end of this area. What you saw at the very beginning of that, you saw a glow as the deputy was turning around. This was the Tomkai Road area, where fire engines were now leaving the Tomkai Road area because it was too intense hot. It was not possible to drive vehicles on the public road heading north, and so it gets to the area where there's other fatalities. So the deputy was driving south along the along West Road there. So right around that time, and that was at 1:15, is when CAL FIRE requested PG&E to shut down the Redwood Valley area, complete area from power because of the lines that were potentially going to come down. And have we got to the victims of the fire yet? Okay, next slide. So the Emergency Operations Center was soon to be up and running. At 1:30 is when we've confirmed that there are no cell phones that are working in the Potter Valley area. So please follow on the red arrow and the blue arrow what's happening at both times of the evacuations. We did have a Coyote Valley Tribal Police, and Coyote Valley is real close to where Redwood Valley and 101 are together. and he began helping us with evacuations also. And so what you saw is you saw people that weren't being dispatched to this scene, but understood the magnitude of the disaster and began helping. So one of the interesting things here is people are saying, well, there were 2 fires, there were 3 fires, there were 1 fire, and today's press conference is not going to sit here and answer your question on that one. In my opinion, there was 1 fire that was spotting, and it just continued to grow, and then all the sides grew into each other. But that's what happened. So at 1:45 is when reverse 911 went in for the Redwood Valley area. That, for the most part, cell phones were not working in also because of the power outage. And hardline phones were working. However, this is after what you just saw. So this is right after the deputy sheriff was evacuating on his public address system. And CAL FIRE at 1:30 had requested a hard evacuation, and another word for hard evacuation would be mandatory evacuation. We do not take people kicking and screaming out of their house. If we knock on the door and say it's time to leave, and they say they want to stay, we're not going to expend our resources by handcuffing them and putting them back in the car. We're going to move on to the next houses and let people make an intelligent choice. Hopefully they're going to leave. Okay. So, and then at 1:30 is when CAL FIRE said both sides of Redwood Valley, East Road, West Road, and Tom Kai, and if you've had a chance to drive, and don't do it just to look, but if you've driven out there, you'll see this area that I'm circling. So this is a Tom Kai area and the north end of West Road and East Road. This was the biggest hot spot in the Redwood Valley area. This did the most damage, and certainly, unfortunately, this is where the tragic lives were lost, in that area. All right, and the evacuations began from the railroad line here, basically, at the bottom of the map. We started a mandatory evacuation from here north because there was certainly nowhere to know where we were going. Now, you'll see 2 blue dots here. You'll see this is where CAL FIRE's headquarters are for the county. And you'll see this blue dot. This is a Golden Rule trailer park. This is a very heavily populated area that we're also are concerned, and you'll see how that plays in. All right. Next slide, please, Jared. So Lieutenant Cadillo at 1:45 is when he told dispatch, we have 2 main fires here. We have Potter Valley, we have Redwood Valley, and to continue with the reverse 911. And CAL FIRE also was working on evacuations on Road J. Road J is in the area that you saw the deputy drive past here. It was on the, it's north of the fire station, north of the red line there. You'll see continuing on down of the reverse 911 request, and we were requesting all possible help. Let's see, when did Santa Rosa call come in? Was that later on? A little later, 4 o'clock. And just a little, at 4 o'clock, our Regional Office of Emergency Services out of Alameda made a request to us to send 50 deputies to Napa County. So what we're seeing is mutual aid that we would normally count on between Napa, Sonoma, Lake, Mendocino is touchy at best because everybody had their own disasters to deal with. We did have Humboldt County coming down and helping us fairly close to the beginning of this, and we're certainly waiting for them to arrive. So you can see that at 1:50 is when the evacuations were going out for Golden Rule, which is on the west side of Highway 101. And we were already having deputies basically trying to drive up driveways and seeing if there were any houses in the area they could contact. So we are to the point right now, I think by the next slide, where I'm going to say, CAL FIRE, correct me please, approximately 90% of the vegetation that happened during this fire had happened. So next slide. So we were doing the another reverse 911, and it's to the Tom Kye, Golden Rule, Baker's Creek. So basically, this is rural area. This is not heavily populated, but a lot of locked gates and dirt roads. And then at 2:15 is when our units confirmed that the fire had crossed 101 and was heading towards a populated area in Redwood Valley and the Golden Rule Trailer Park. We opened up the shelters, and we were concerned at this point of Pine Mountain. And Pine Mountain is a very significant conversation because Pine Mountain was evacuated, and the citizens certainly were not happy after day 2 of not being able to go back. But I want you to see where this is the fire, northern part of the fire line, and Pine Mountain is here, and part of Pine Mountain, Mariposa Creek Road, is well inside the burn area where structures were burned. So this is an area where the fire, we were very concerned. However, around 6 in the morning is something very, almost miraculous occurred, and that's the wind shifted. I think it was around 6, 7. I'll let CAL FIRE talk about that. But the winds shifted. Instead of the dry winds blowing from the east to the west, we now had winds coming from the west, or at least the northwest, to the southeast. And winds are important. Mendocino County is used to having winds that come from the ocean. One can assume that winds that come from the ocean have moisture in them. And the winds that occurred at 11:34, when Chief Pauley was there, when Chief Pauley was at this first fire location, the winds were coming from the east, and they were dry winds. So if you want to call these Santa Ana winds, if you want to call them Southern California winds in Northern California, whatever it was, we were having winds from the east come to the west with very little, if any, moisture in them. So that was the initial onset. Okay, and then you'll see we continue to do evacuations in basically north in Potter Valley, and Lieutenant Cadillo working in the Baker's Creek area. Next slide. Now we're just going to go kind of quickly of what government is doing. We're 3 hours into the fire now, and we're setting up the emergency shelters, and we're the fire is continuing to do evacuations. An incident command post has been set up at the Redwood Valley Fire Station. It wasn't completely staffed, but that's where the incident command post was stationed. And then at 2:45 in the morning is when CAL FIRE said at least 2,000 acres burning in Potter Valley and heading towards Redwood Valley was on their radio channel. Okay. So we're continuing with the green. What that is basically we're just putting what we know, what we can say factually based on our radio traffic and our recordings. This is what we started doing at that time. We were able to get 9 search and rescue members out at 3:30 or 3:10. I'm sorry. And one of the things about evacuations, people often will not evacuate their house if they don't have their pets or their livestock, and search and rescue immediately started working with people on getting their pets and their livestock to safe locations. At 3:12 is when one of our deputies located a burn victim and transported an ambulance. We didn't transport an ambulance, transported to Ukiah Valley Medical Center. Next slide, please. And then you can see Ukiah Police Department jumped in. The Sheriff's Office basically called all people in, and we continued with the evacuations. And then the CAL FIRE report that Redwood Valley Fire is headed south here, south towards Highway 20. Whether it was weather related or the weather that a fire creates, the fire was heading south, and that certainly was broadcast because Highway 20 is not just a significant route of transportation for transportation and citizens, but first responders also. Highway 20, that would have been significant. That did not occur, but we were preparing for it. Next slide, please. So continuing with the evacuation locations, and then we closed 101. CHP closed 101 at 4:20, and we sent another reverse 911 to the evacuation area, basically making sure people knew. Now, we're sending evacuation reverse 911 at this point to houses which were on the ground. But if someone had registered their cell phone and their cell phone was working, if they had registered their cell phone to that location, that's our mode of communicating. Now, something very significant happens at 4. It's not on this slide. It's when Laughlin burnt at 4, I believe. So at 407, at this location, the most critical communication infrastructure that we needed burnt. And this took the town of Willits, took away their 911, their hard lines, their cell phone, and their internet. Now, if you think of ways that we communicate, you're going to communicate with internet, cell phone, hard line, and emergency 911. So 100% of communication was taken from Willits, with the exception that at the 459 prefix, they could call internally. They could call other 459 numbers. So they could call the police department. However, the police department couldn't call the sheriff's office. So that's when the sheriff's office began working with getting satellite phones into the area and our ham radios. And let me say this, and if you're watching this from the Bay Area and you don't know what a ham radio is, let me tell you what a ham radio is. Ham radio is, it's old school radio communications, but we have a very active ham radio club and responsible group in our county. And our hospitals are actually equipped with ham radios. And our ham radio operators came into the Emergency Operations Center, and they were the ones communicating to hospitals regarding patient transport with ambulances, and also they were moving supplies from one hospital to another because of ham radio operations. So ham radios are not a thing of the past. They were very instrumental in this disaster. So we're continuing with the 911 evacuations from Lieutenant Barney. Okay, next one. And so we sent that reverse 911 out. The high schools opened up for evacuation, and that's when our the structures at the end of Redwood Drive were on fire. So we continued the evacuation, and now we start jumping ahead just in hour by hour. Go ahead. So at 6:30 is when Willits or Howard Hospital lost internet connectivity. That's really significant when you think of medical. We rely on internet for everything, you know, whether it's patients' medical records or just talking to another doctor, and they lost all communications. And look at this, the wind speeds around 5 begin to drop. Now, I don't have the facts and figures and the data to tell you, however, we're working on it. In this area of Potter Valley, there is at least one, possibly two, privately owned weather stations. And one of these weather stations, we've been told, has a peak of a very high temperature happening. It was in, regular temperature for what you would have at midnight, 40, 45 degrees, and all of a sudden it spiked up into the unregisterable state and then dropped back down. So we don't know, we haven't seen that data, we've heard it's here, but it's going to help us get an idea of the fire path and the fire distance at an exact time. So that's some of the information we don't have for today. Okay, next slide, moving on to 8 o'clock. So this is an hour and a half right here, and it's just talking about, we were told of road closures in Santa Rosa, and so we couldn't get down there, but then again, our resources, extra resources couldn't come up. If Sonoma and Lake or Napa had given us some, they couldn't have come up. And we're continuing to go through the evacuations as well as the critical patients. And so the helicopters were not being used to transport patients at that time because of the high wind, and also the incredible amount of smoke that was all the way down to the floor of every part of this affected area. So at 7:40, CalStar was notified they had been cleared for air ops, and then they were starting to transport patients. Okay. So now we go into another hour, and this is mainly just the sun's coming up, and we're trying to make sure that we can staff everything. All government workers, at least for Mendocino County, every county employee is an emergency service worker. And at that point, we were calling in every possible employee to start staffing the phones. At one time, we had 3 lines going, the 467 number for citizens to call in, and that had to go to 9 lines. Now think of that in the morning. How can you go from 3 lines to 9 lines on a Monday morning? But it happened, and it happened because people understood what needed to be done. At 8:45, the sheriff's office finds another burn victim, and we arranged for them to be transported through the ambulance. And this is when, at 8:45 is when the CAL FIRE spotter plane reported that there were several thousand acres that had occurred in the last 8 hours. All right? So now this is logistical. We have CAL FIRE firefighter that was transported to the hospital, smoke inhalation, and we have our Facebook, the Sheriff's Office Facebook is a very active Facebook account, and we had people contacting us through Facebook because they had no other way of communicating. And they were, the Willits, the county library inside the city of Willits had internet. And it's available, it's 24/7 if you're in the parking lot. And so that became somewhat of a hub of communication in Willits. People could go there and communicate on the internet. Not all of them could do on cell phones, but they could do the internet connectivity. So you see that our deputy sheriffs arrived, and we, at 11:30, we sent our crews to this completely damaged communication infrastructure, which we happen to have the spare parts, and we have an incredible, brilliant radio tech, and he repaired it, and unfortunately, within 24 hours, as the fire returned and the wind changed, that fire took out our repairs, and so it took about 72 hours to repair that since then, or when it happened. When it went out initially, CAL FIRE lost a good portion of their phone lines, and CAL FIRE was able to get a dispatcher down, or a fire captain, I believe, down to the Sheriff's Office dispatch center, so where we were able to take care of some of the CAL FIRE calls, because we've set up, ahead of time, we've set up the mutual communications between the two. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that's where we are the first 12 hours. That's a rough draft. This is not specific. I mean, this is as specific as we have right now of where the fire is, of the 36,600 acres. Okay, and so at noon, so 12 and a half hours later after the fire started, this is what was in the Redwood Valley, Potter Valley area, trying to really and truly wrap their heads around what had just happened for the last 12 and a half hours. And in a rural county, maybe in a Bay Area person isn't going to really understand and comprehend this, but in a rural county, to get that type of staffing in 12 and a half hours after a large, Mendocino County, certainly largest fire disaster in our history we've had, that's very significant. So it's 10:53, and we are going to 11:15. Is there more? One more slide. Okay, there you have. So the fire, that slide speaks for itself, and the last line sums it up. 9 lives were confirmed lost, and families were changed forever. Our community's been changed forever, and we're certainly going to document this as well as possible, because if we don't remember history, certainly we're going to repeat history. And we don't want in 50 years for this fire to occur again. We want the documentation to be clear of when these elements are here, how are we going to prevent lives from being lost? Are we going to build smarter? Of course we are. Are we going to make our community safer? Of course we are. And hopefully we'll learn from this. So I have multiple fire authorities here. I've spoken to regard the law enforcement part. Are there any questions? We might get out of here before 11. This is good.
So,
yes.
When you say you don't remember history or repeat history, just thinking to the initial emergency response, what, in terms of, not talking about where things were built, but in terms of decisions that were made, where could there be more, where's there room for improvement?
Room for improvement, and I'll be very clear on this. When I became a deputy sheriff in 1985, in the northern part of our county, Laytonville, the fire departments had air raid sirens, and many fire departments had air raid sirens. A lot of those air raid sirens were taken down because of citizens complaining about the noise that air raid sirens produce. whether it's a Saturday at noon or, you know, if it's 10 o'clock at night and it's blown to get the volunteers. And so because technology has brought us to the point of having, you know, it started with pagers, or for firefighters, there was a thing called a plectron many years ago, and we've gone through the stages of technology. And I hope that Mendocino County can take a step back and we can reposition air raid sirens. So even if, like the town of Willits, city of Willits, if it loses all connectivity to the world and there's a need to notify citizens of a disaster, I hope we're going to have a siren. And I know our district attorney and I have talked about it to try to work to get funds to offer air raid sirens to as many fire departments as we want them. And I'm hoping that the citizens will not forget this. So in 5 years, when they want to complain about the noise, they're going to say, but there's a reason for it. The reason is to notify people immediately that this is a real disaster. We need to get out of here. But I think that's a fair question for the two fire chiefs also. You want to? Chief Turner.
Good morning. I'm Brendan Turner, the acting fire chief at Redwood Valley. Like Sheriff Allman just talked about, we at Redwood Valley have an air raid siren that historically was used to notify volunteers of emergencies. After that, that's been several years prior to my joining the department 22 years ago. It's been blown every day except for Sunday at noon. So it's a manually operated button. It's antiquated, so we've been working with the sheriff, just kind of in the discussion phases right now, about upgrading that system so that it can be used to notify our citizens of emergencies. So, and I don't know if Chief Pauly wants to add to that or not.
I can simply state, in Potter Valley, we do have a siren. We made the decision not to blow it because the local people would not have known what it meant, and we didn't want anybody on the road because of the lines and trees that were down, and it would have sent them a mixed message about what's happening. The safest place at that time was for them in their homes, and the decision was made not to blow it.
So at one of our press conferences, a person asked us how she could thank CAL FIRE and the fire departments, and I'm a cop, I'm not a firefighter. But I think that if somebody was to say, ask the same question, how could they thank? It would be, listen to CAL FIRE in the spring to talk about 100-foot defensible space. Don't use shake for roofing. Think about fire danger. We have other communities in our county, and certainly other counties have very congested communities where fire danger really wasn't put as the most important critical thing to think about when you're building a house. Well, I can tell you that there are 9 lives that are lost that their family members say that when they rebuild, they're going to think about this because their lives have been, their families have been forever changed. So there's others, it's a fair question, lessons learned. I know that some people are watching this very video for the purpose of litigation, and you're not going to hear me being critical of other departments. As far as the sheriff's office goes, I think that there are lessons learned on this, and improving the ability of sergeants to make an immediate call for a reverse 911 is something that we're going to be looking at. Working with the fire departments where they will have the ability to immediately request a reverse 911 is something we're looking at. And reverse 911 is actually an industry name of a company that calls themselves, we don't use reverse 911, we use Everbridge. But you understand what it is. And for those who don't understand what a reverse 911 call is, to a geographical location, we can send a message to that area, to that geographical location, and if somebody has a cell phone that they've gone to our website, MendocinoSheriff.com, and they've registered their cell phone to a geographical location, when we have a disaster or we have an emergency, an escaped inmate or a propane truck that's turned over, we can send out a reverse 911 call to those people at the hard lines that are affected and any cell phones that have been registered to that geographical location. So there are lessons to be learned here. There's lessons to be learned as we go throughout every day, I hope. And we are looking at that. We're looking at this with a do not repeat this situation. Fair question. Thank you. Anything else? Yes, sir?
I don't think I heard too much about
Chief Turner, Road J.
So when we were initially dispatched as Redwood Valley Fire to an incident within our district, it's hard to see on this map, but where East and West Road meet, it continues north up into the Tomkai Canyon. So the initial fire that we responded to was in about a 5-acre field in that area where the Russian River goes through. Within a few minutes, the fire was actually cresting over the ridge, and then we were also receiving reports of fires up in the Road J area. So it was not simultaneous, but it was very close in proximity. So when we first arrived at the fire in the Redwood Valley area, the wind was so strong, and the video that Sheriff Allman played really didn't even do justice from the fire behavior from what we saw. And it looked intense on that video. On the ground, the fire was actually spreading in almost all directions because of the geography there. It was in a bowl and it was swirling. So we had fire impacting basically all 4 sides. It was jumping the road at the Tomkai area as well as east and west, and then proceeding south at almost equal speeds, which I've never seen before. Did that answer your question? Okay.
So I hate to use the word perfect in the phrase of perfect storm, but this was if things, I don't know of how things could have got any worse with a wind, with a fuel load, with a fuel humidity. I'm not exactly sure, but we'll learn from it. Any other questions? All right, I'd like to thank you for being here. I'd like to thank the people who are watching this. And once again, I at the very beginning, I gave a somewhat of a informational thing. These are the facts that we have as of today, November 9th. And if additional information is obtained, and we have not requested everything that we've not received everything we've requested, when it is, I hope to give a really full overview, because the first 12 hours of the fire is when lives were lost and the houses were lost. And the rest, the 2 weeks after that was realizing what has happened and putting all the pieces together and helping the victims. So to the County of Mendocino, to citizens, thank you. Thank you for being so strong. Thank you very much.